And also you can check out all his other great stuff at chroniclesofstrength.com. And Pat, welcome back to Hands On Apologetics.
Always a joy to be here, Gary. Thank you again for having me on.
Hey, yeah. Well, hey, when you come into the dojo, this is where, only the strongest and the brightest, are ready to engage. Because you, my friend, philosophy like the back of your hand. I love your works in theistic apologetics, and so it's always great. I learn a ton when you're on the show.
Well, thank you. That means quite a lot coming from you, Gary. So I graciously and humbly accept.
All right. So yeah, let's talk about this cumulative case. First, I guess, is it like a standard model? Is this a common way that atheists would argue?
My impression is this is becoming more common and is becoming the more popular approach. And I have a few, I guess, reasons why. I think part of what's motivating this is, I think for the most part, it's kind of been realized that there are no real single knockdown arguments against God's existence, against theism. Especially when it comes to something like the logical problem of evil, it seems like there's now widespread agreement, among theists and atheists that just doesn't work. There is really no good logical problem of evil. So it seems like in advancing their case, atheists have tried to build more of, a cumulative case. And the idea of a cumulative case is you just gather various lines of evidence that you think are better predicted or more easily explained by your hypothesis versus any other rival hypothesis. So it kind of turns into this really kind of a game. I call it a game of Bayesian tennis because we're using a tool of Bayesian probability where we try to evaluate competing worldviews. And by worldviews, we really just mean a large scale theory of everything. So examples of that would be classical theism versus naturalism, for example. And then we look at certain data and we ask, okay, is this data more expected, right, on naturalism or theism? And if we can argue that it's more expected on theism, then we can say that data actually counts in favor of theism to some degree, whatever it is. Or if we say that this is more expected on naturalism, then we would say that this counts in favor of naturalism. And then it kind of just becomes this task of trying to weigh up the evidence and assess the relevant probabilities, which can get really knotty. But I think we could probably make it clear enough to see that my position, Gary, is overwhelmingly the cumulative case follows theism. And I take actually a pretty bold claim. I say that any piece of evidence so far that I've seen that atheists claim in favor only superficially favors atheism. But every time on a more substantial analysis, it can be shown to actually count more towards a theistic hypothesis rather than an atheistic hypothesis. And I think there's some reasons that these mistakes are made, but we can go whatever direction you want. You can tell me your thoughts. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a strong point. And so, yeah, I think, one of the problems, of course, is weighing. I think it's almost an appeal to emotion in some way, right. That, you might have, everything that's important is science. So I can put science in this category, and that's a very weighty thing that you would expect, if God doesn't exist or something like that, where it's hard to discern it objectively. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And this is why you can't be superficial about this. You really have to roll up your sleeves and dig in and see, okay, what are we really talking about here? You say science. Well, what does science mean? Well, whatever else science means, it depends on our ability to rationally investigate the universe. It depends on our ability to actually know things about a world with stability and orderly structure and stuff like that. Now, if we're talking about orderly structure and stability and our ability to know things, well, it seems like all that data is contingent upon, I would say, a whole confluence of different conditions that are best, if only possibly, explained by theism. One of these, of course, would be the principle of sufficient reason, which we've talked about before, right? Because if we don't have the principle of sufficient reason, which says that anything that exists has an adequate explanation for its existence, if that isn't a principle that we can know as a broadly logical truth, sort of a priori, well, then something having no explanation becomes immediately competitive with something having any explanation, which is immediately devastating for any claims that we have to knowledge or science or anything like that. But then the problem for the atheist is, how do I hold on to the principle of sufficient reason without also then conceding where that leads ultimately, which is to God's existence, right? Because the classic theistic argument, especially contingency and cosmological arguments, is that in order to satisfy and secure the principle of sufficient reason, we have to get to that which is intrinsically uncausable and purely actual, which is God, right? So whatever else we mean by science, it's going to be contingent upon us being knowers, and that's going to be contingent upon the principle of sufficient reason. But we can only satisfy the principle of sufficient reason if theism is true. So in that deeper analysis, I would immediately say, yeah, actually science is better predicted, is better explained by a theistic hypothesis than an atheistic one. Now that was a kind of quick couple of moves there, but that's one way that I think, again, like superficially, you get these kind of just assertions like science or the progress of science. But every time on any of these things, when you dive deeper and deeper and deeper, I think it always comes out not just a little bit, but strongly in favor of a theistic hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. So what would be the typical points of an atheistic cumulative argument?
Yeah, so there's a number. I mean, so the atheist might say, well, let's look at the world and let's see what sort of data might be better expected on atheism. Now, the biggest one, of course, is evil and suffering. I think that's going to be a good one to kind of start off with, because I think it helps to illuminate a number of mistakes that I think predominantly atheist apologists make when issuing their cumulative case. But they might say evil, they might say evolution. They might say the ruthless progress of science, right? That's kind of how it's sometimes phrased, right? The ruthless progress of science that keeps pushing supernatural explanations like into a corner or something like that, right? So we kind of already hinted at how you might think about that. So those would be kind of like three big ones, but they might also say religious diversity or non-belief. Those are kind of like some of the more primary points that atheists are going to say. Like these things are kind of more of what we would expect if atheism were true rather than theism. And in that case, all other considerations equal, we should believe that atheism is the case. Now, of course, depending on who you talk to, they might have different data points, but I think those are probably the most common major ones that you're going to see in an atheistic cumulative case apologetic.
Okay. So when you run into that cumulative case, what's the best way to take it apart? Should we go piece by piece through it and break each line, or is there a more broad way to do that?
I think at the end of the day, you do have to, again, roll up your sleeves and look at each of the claims independently and make an assessment, piecemeal. I think you have to do it piecemeal if you're going to do anything of an adequate job for something like this. But maybe we can just like briefly start with evil, because I think this exposes a number. I think each of these expose a common mistake that happens with the atheistic cumulative case apologetic. Evil's a good one, right? Because here's the example I want to talk about with evil, right? We're trying to ask, what is the likelihood of this data given a particular hypothesis versus what is the likelihood of this data without that particular hypothesis? Now, the problem is I think the atheist often stops at just the first question. What is the likelihood of this data given this particular hypothesis? But they don't compare the relevant ratio, because it's the ratio that matters. And what I mean by that is, even if you think something is just, say, a low probability, or it doesn't have a high likelihood given one hypothesis, that by itself doesn't really tell you much. What we really need to know is it more likely on a rival hypothesis? That's the key. Now, I think we can give a brief illustration to draw this point. And I borrow from my friend Tim McGrew here. So imagine you're in the woods, and you find a cabin that looks abandoned. There's moss on the door. It's like there's no lights on. It looks abandoned. So you form the hypothesis this cabin is abandoned. Why? Because it seems to have the features and characteristics that you would expect if that hypothesis were true, right? So this is this idea of expectation from a particular hypothesis. However, you peek inside and you discover that there's a cup of hot steeping tea in there. Now, what happens when you discover that tea? Well, immediately you revise your hypothesis. Why? Because the probability of finding a cup of hot tea in an abandoned cabin is not only exceptionally low, but you know that it's far lower than if you found it that it's far lower than what you would expect if the cabin were occupied, is what I mean to say. But here's the really important consideration. is that you might actually still think that the probability of finding the cup of tea in an occupied cabin is itself low. I mean, what are the chances of that in any given occupied cabin that you'll find a cup of hot steeping tea? I don't know. It probably is low, but 2%, something like that.
Right.
It doesn't, but that doesn't matter. What matters is the ratio. It's the ratio between the two. And clearly, even if you think it's low on the first hypothesis that the cabin is occupied, it's far, far, far lower, if not impossible, on the second hypothesis that the cabin is abandoned. And it's that ratio or the comparison between the two that ultimately matters. And I think this is really relevant for the problem of evil, because maybe you do think that the amount of suffering in this world is low, that God would allow a world like this, right? Maybe you just think that the probability is low, that God would allow a world with this much suffering. Maybe you think it's like 2% or 1% or something like that. But again, by itself, that is almost completely irrelevant. What we have to ask is, what are the chances that I would still experience this world, including all the suffering and all the judgments I make about suffering, if God didn't exist? And there I want to say is that frankly, I think it's 0%, but whatever it is, it's far, far lower than the theistic hypothesis. Why? Well, simply because everything that our judgment of evil is contingent upon is best, if not only, explained by theism.